So yes, I'll be talking about the research that Linda, Zoe and I conducted into women's experience of post-traumatic growth after a traumatic birth. And just to say that there was also, so that we recently published a paper off the back of the thesis, which our colleague Kira Masterson of the University of Leeds also co-supervised, as she's not here today. And in the presentation today, I will be talking about a few of our kind of findings that didn't make it into the kind of final cut for the paper. So not everything I talk about today will be in there, but both the full thesis and the paper are both available online, not behind a paywall, if you did want to look at them afterwards. So I suppose firstly thinking, what do we mean by post-traumatic growth? And one definition is that it's a positive change in one's beliefs or functioning that's resulted specifically from a struggle with highly challenging life circumstances. So this is something a little bit different to the psychological concept of resilience. We can think of resilience as being a kind of bouncing back to or staying at your kind of current level of well-being or functioning. But post-traumatic growth is going a little bit beyond that. It's experiencing something more than or better than the state that you were in before. And the concept of growth also allows for the fact that there might be coexisting difficult or negative symptoms alongside that. So if you think of resilience as kind of a staying the same as or a bouncing back to the same point, growth is about expanding beyond that, even if there are also difficulties and kind of negative things there at the same time. And it's important to say as well that post-traumatic growth is thought to arise specifically from the struggle to cope with the effects of the trauma, and that's kind of what facilitates that growth. So Tedeschi and Calhoun's model of post-traumatic growth includes kind of 5 different domains of kind of what post-traumatic growth is. So those are outlined there. So there's relating to others, which is about having a deepening in your relationship or connection to other people, increased compassion. Then you've got new possibilities, which is perceiving new opportunities following the trauma. Personal strength, which we can think of as having an increased sense of personal strength or self-reliance. Spiritual change, which is a deeper sense of spirituality or a more meaningful or deeper connection or understanding to life. And appreciation of life, which is around maybe having a changed sense of priorities and appreciation of the little things in life. So this is kind of what post-traumatic growth is understood to be. And in terms of the research that we did, the aims of that were really, it was born out of recognizing that there wasn't very much research on post-traumatic growth, specifically following a difficult birth or birth trauma. And as Linda mentioned, a difficult birth is different to other kinds of potentially traumatic events in various ways that might influence post-traumatic growth. And there was a call, a kind of recognized need for more qualitative research to provide deeper insights into the nature of positive outcomes that might occur following a traumatic birth. So we were looking to conduct quite an in-depth qualitative study looking at women's experiences of post-traumatic growth after birth trauma to aid our understanding of the mechanisms that foster post-traumatic growth and maybe direct future research. So in terms of the methodology, I recruited 8 women via social media with help from the Birth Trauma Association. And the eligibility criteria was really women who self-defined as having experienced a traumatic birth and self-defined as having experienced post-traumatic growth following that within the last 5 years. And then the data was collected through semi-structured interviews, which I carried out myself and analysed using an analytical method called interpretive phenomenological analysis. And so just a note on this, which is to say that this study and this methodology was really looking for quite an in-depth take on this issue rather than very broad generalizable research, which is why there's a small sample size. But it's also worth noting that a limitation of this is that it meant that the 8 women that I interviewed were quite similar in their characteristics. So for example, all of the women were white British, and we should just hold that in mind when we're interpreting the findings, because we know that there are differences in terms of the experience of maternity services, birth, trauma, and growth that might be influenced by your ethnic background, for example. So I've got three themes that I'm going to be talking through with you, but I also have three separate sort of finding sections, which I've called the context sections. So this is the first context section here, which isn't a full theme in itself, because the kind of context of the birth trauma wasn't the main focus of this research. And these findings that came out of the interviews were kind of more descriptive rather than things that could be categorized into themes. But I think they are still important in understanding the context for the birth trauma experiences. And there were kind of 5 different elements to that. So the women I interviewed spoke about kind of pre-existing factors that influenced their birth trauma. So that could be having a history of trauma and abuse, how already having an anxious personality type, and having pre-existing fears around the birth. So that those were some of the things that influenced their experience of birth trauma. The other one was the hospital environment. So the birth happening in conditions that didn't feel sanitary or clean, or where there was a lack of privacy or dignity. The other factor was birth-specific events. So this was experiencing things during the birth like episiotomies, emergency or unplanned C-sections, severe perinatal tears, extreme pain, but also things that happen during pregnancy, such as developing gestational diabetes or preeclampsia. The fourth factor was experiencing what they felt was a deficit in compassion and care from medical staff. So experiencing feelings of being patronised or dismissed during their birth experience, and feeling like they weren't kept well informed, or that communication was poorer than they'd have liked. And the final factor in this context section is the aftermath. So thinking about what happened in the early postnatal period, which included for the women I interviewed, things like other stressful life events occurring in that early postnatal period, bereavements, health conditions, problems breastfeeding. So all this is to say that the trauma wasn't just kind of one single moment or event for these women. It was cumulative, and the overall effect of a variety of experiences throughout their pregnancy and birth journey and beyond. And the second context section that I'll just talk about briefly was the psychological impact of the births. So the women spoke about these different emotional responses that they had following their birth trauma, including trauma-type symptoms, anger, guilt and shame, and envy. And these were the predominant distressing emotions and psychological responses that they had. And I just highlight this because I think it helps us understand the emotional environment in which the struggle to cope and subsequent post-traumatic growth kind of was occurring. This is what was going on for the women when they started that period, that path to growth. So this is the first theme that came out of the interviews of the data. So the overarching theme is called the total opposite to what I'd expected. And just to say, all of the themes and sub-themes are named after direct quotes from the interviews. So this theme has 2 sub-themes, as you can see underneath. And this theme depicts the struggle to accommodate the birth experience in the postnatal period. So that first sub-theme there, I thought it was a conspiracy. This spoke to the expectations and the assumptions about the birth, and also how the women thought they might cope with birth, which differed from their actual experience. So some of the women spoke about being deprived of an idealized or hoped for birth experience, and moments they'd looked forward to and been told about, like the golden hour of uninterrupted skin-to-skin contact and the tears of joy that they were hoping to experience, and felt a real sense of anger and loss around this. But there was also a sense of shock and betrayal at not having been warned of what was to come. And some of the women spoke about a dilemma there of, they wouldn't have wanted to have been scared off birth, but at the same time, they felt very unprepared. I've got some quotes here, which I won't be reading through the quotes, but just to illustrate these themes. And the second sub-theme in this section, I'm supposed to be good at this. This really spoke to how the women integrated their birth trauma experience into their sense of identity as individuals, as women, as mothers. And a lot of the women spoke about a real sense of failure around a sense that they hadn't done birth properly. For example, because the birth hadn't been quote unquote natural in their eyes, they'd had to have a lot of medical intervention. Or perhaps because they'd expected to respond more assertively with medical staff or with more emotional restraint, and they didn't see themselves as the sort of person who might not behave assertively in a crisis, and felt quite shocked that they had responded as they had during the traumatic birth experience. And this is the final sort of bit of context which I'll introduce here. So again, not a theme, just some additional information that came out of the interviews. So this context was around the things that facilitated growth for the women I interviewed. So one of the facilitators of growth was having good outlets for sharing their experience. So this could be family and friends, it could be to midwives, feeding back to hospital staff in meetings after the birth, or speaking to therapists. Another facilitator of growth for this group of women was drawing on their existing strengths. So this was drawing on being having a sense of optimism that had always been there for them, or drawing on strategies that they'd already honed and developed in their lives to deal with other hardships. A third facilitator was putting boundaries in place. So this could have been boundaries with, for example, family members that they felt were a negative influence in the aftermath of the birth, people who, for example, were overbearing, or people who tried to put an overly positive spin on the birth experience and the trauma, which they didn't find healthy or helpful. The fourth factor that facilitated growth was physical healing. So the women spoke about struggling to achieve growth or start that process of growth while they were still healing physically from the birth. And finally, having a space to process and reflect. So that included things like limiting visitors or partners, facilitating alone time, and decreasing unnecessary kind of stresses in their life. So these are the things that help facilitate growth. So the second theme that came out of the data was called I See It a Little Bit Differently Now. And this is about the processes the women experienced in coming to a place of growth. So the first one is called I Wanted to Understand. And this spoke to the kind of very active process of meaning making, questioning, and reflecting on the birth experience and what it kind of meant that the women in my study described going through to come to a place of growth. The second one, maybe I'm not just weak. So this sub-theme speaks to being able to find an increased sense of self-compassion, accepting that their responses during the birth were valid and accepting it, what happened as a trauma, and moving away from this idea that some of them had described feeling, which was, you know, what happened to me wasn't bad enough. Other people have experiences that are much worse than mine. Maybe I can't label it or name it trauma. And they did mention that professional validation, for example, from midwives around saying, you know, this was a really difficult experience, was really helpful in coming to a greater place of self-compassion. The third sub-theme in this category was it's getting home with a healthy baby. So this was the process by which women put their experience into perspective, but crucially without minimizing it. So being able to find some good in what happened, the coming home with a healthy baby, that having a relationship with their child and viewing that relationship in a positive way. But without a sense of kind of shame around that, or nothing kind of punitive around, you know, I shouldn't have felt bad about this, but just coming to more of a place of gratitude. And then the final sub-theme here called It's Just a Memory Now. So another one of the processes that women went through in coming to a place of growth was being able to somehow put the experience behind them in some way, which included things like letting go of self-blame and refocusing when it felt like the time was right on the present and on the future, rather than on the past and the past birth experience. And then the final theme from the data is called A Much Better Place, which has 5 sub-themes here. And I'm not going to talk about this theme in very much detail, but it just speaks to kind of how the growth manifested in participants in this study. Now, you might remember earlier I spoke about the 5 different domains of post-traumatic growth, and the 5 sub-themes here map onto them quite neatly. So that first one, I could have let this floor me, that mapped on quite well to the concept of personal strength. And he's so much more capable than I gave him credit for. That theme spoke to the post-traumatic growth domain of relating to other people and experiencing a change in your relationship to others, and so on. So there were a lot of similarities in what what we'd expect growth to look like from other studies in other populations and in this population of people, in these participants. But there were also some more idiosyncratic differences that we noted in how growth manifested. So, for example, in the personal strength domain, some of the women spoke about through the birth experience, really experiencing the power of their own body. So experiencing their strength, not just in terms of an emotional sense of strength, but also in terms of physically what they'd managed to overcome, and that they'd managed to produce a child, breastfeed a child, and having a really positive relationship with their own body, which they attributed to the trauma rather than more generically just to childbirth. And another kind of more specific finding was in the domain of kind of relating to others, or he's so much more capable than I gave him credit for here, which was a finding that a lot of women spoke about the deeper relationship they had with their partners who experienced the trauma with them, who were there with them while they were giving birth. And that's quite unusual. A lot of traumatic events happen alone, but this is a traumatic event that not only medical staff witnessed, but also their partners in many cases. And so experiencing a deeper connection to a partner through that was also something that might be a little bit more birth specific when we're thinking about what post-traumatic growth looks like in women who've experienced birth trauma. So just to conclude, I suppose one of the things that this research threw up was a real dilemma here around how much should you know in advance before a birth about what might go wrong. And the women themselves felt really unsure about that. But there was this sense of actually it would have been great to have been a little bit better prepared, feel better prepared about what might happen. And something that came through really strongly was the role of social narratives around birth and motherhood, and what a huge impact this had had on the women. The shock when the birth experience hadn't gone as well, how that affected their identities, the feeling of failure as a mother and as a woman. And several of the women also spoke about the influence of things like hypnobirthing and the natural birth movement and TV shows and media narratives around birth that had left them with an idea that that their bodies would just know what to do and that everything would be fine and that they were kind of made to do this. And so it felt like a real shock when that didn't quite happen. In terms of fostering growth in clinical practice, I think it's really important to emphasize that much more evidence is needed before we can really confidently and safely kind of have a plan for how we can do that. So it's really important to be tentative and sensitive when introducing the idea of post-traumatic growth to women who've had a traumatic birth. But I think that what we can do is let women know that we know that some people are able to experience post-traumatic growth. Be sensitive to the fact that might feel it might not feel like the right time for a woman to be thinking about that, and it might never feel like the right time. And we don't want to be kind of insensitive in pushing that agenda, but that we do know there are certain factors that can facilitate growth for some people, and potentially sharing some of those stories like the ones in this research to instill a sort of sense of hope for women who are interested in looking at this as a possible outcome for them. But just remembering that overall it's an individual process, and we still don't know enough yet about the factors that facilitate growth to sort of prescribe anything or be able to say if you do X, then growth is likely to be experienced. So there's still a lot more research to be done. And just to end, just wanting to thank the Max Hamilton Research Fund, Birth Trauma Association, National Childbirth Trust for all the support they gave in making this research possible.